This program was made possible by a generous grant from the Parker Foundation. Gerald and Inez Parker.
Romance of the Ranchos. The words bring images perpetuated in song and film of happy times, of fiestas, of caballeros dressed in outfits trimmed in silver, and their ladies twirling around a dance floor in long dresses with swirling skirts. Certainly there was that. But there were also long hours of tedious work. 300 Native Americans helped build Rancho Wahome. And there were also reports of a leading ranchero getting away with murder. At one adobe, modern visitors swear they've heard ghosts. These rancheros of North San Diego County were pioneers who lived off the land via cattle, crops, and their strength of character. After Mexico's successful revolution from Spain culminated in 1821, Mexican governors in California began distributing land grants, some of them huge, like the giant 133,000-acre Rancho Santa Margarita y las Flores, most of which is now one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the world. And some of them were small, down now to only a few acres. Movie stars of their times played bit to major roles in the ranchos. Joan Crawford donated the big tree in the courtyard at Buena Vista, and Charlie Chaplin visited. It was owned by Margarita Fisher, a big star in silent films, and her husband, Harry Pollard, a Hollywood director. And Leo Carrillo, of Cisco Kid television fame, owned his own rancho, reflecting the heritage of his ranchero forebears. Some of the ranchos, Wahome, Buena Vista, and Carrillo, are in public ownership with tours on a regular basis. Others, like those on the Marine base, still allow the public, but on a more restricted basis. Some owners, like Shelley Caron, schedule regular school groups to view her Marron Adobe, and others, like Pat and Karen Kelly on portions of the old Rancho Agua Hedionda, still revere the adobe, part of their own private home. Much of the ranch land, including most of the current city of Carlsbad and property that was once owned by Oceanside City Councilman John Steiger, have given way to modern development. In this series, KOCT remembers the adobes and ranchos of early California. The Marron Adobe, despite being an historic landmark and only a skosh off a busy freeway, is one of the lesser-known reminders of times gone by. It is believed to be the only adobe in the state of California still occupied by a direct descendant of the original owner of a Mexican land grant. It is opened occasionally for school tours. The property is owned by Shelley Hayes Caron, now only a few acres, was part of a 13,000-acre Rancho Agua Hedionda Mexican land grant to her great-great-granduncle, Juan Maria Romualdo Marron, in 1842. His descendants, unable to pay a $6,000 debt, lost the bulk of the property, but Miss Caron has been able to hold on to a small part of the 400 acres ceded to her great-great-grandfather, Silvestre Marron, and is buried only a few miles away at Mission San Luis Rey. Miss Caron will tell us the story of the ranch.
My great-great-uncle was Juan Maria Romualdo Marron, and he was involved in the early politics of the Presidio in San Diego. In 1839, he applied for a land grant and was issued that land grant in 1842. It was 13,311 acres. My great-great-grandfather was the younger brother of Juan Maria Romualdo by 20 years. There was a great age span between them. And my great-great-grandfather lived on the rancho from the age of 12 with his brother and became his right-hand man. He handled the rancho and the industry that was here. They had a butcher shop, they had an orchard, they had a vineyard. They grew grapes, pomegranates, and pears. Sylvester died here in 1906. Well, everything was homegrown, and of course they had cattle and beef, so the children had milk and popcorn for breakfast sometimes, and beans were never absent from the table. They had jerky, they made beef jerky, and had pomegranates and pears and citrus and grapes. They made wine. So they were, it was quite industrious. And the reason why they were here in this area was because of the water. They had artesian sources of water, and not only had a creek, but 2 artesian ponds, which replenish themselves as you use the water. After the land grant was acquired, through the course of the years, as the families grew, there were 7 adobes here in the Buena Vistita, in the canyon here in Marron Canyon. And this is the home that I live in, is the last standing adobe. Juan Maria Romualdo Marron married Felipa Osuna, and Sylvester married Leonora Osuna. So 2 brothers married 2 sisters. The Osuna daughters were the daughters of Juan Maria Osuna, the first alcalde and the first mayor of San Diego. And his rancho was Rancho San Diego, which is now modern Rancho Santa Fe. So the families traveled between our area here and San Diego and San Diego, because the main commerce of everything was in San Diego. And Sylvester ran the rancho for his brother. He was in charge of a lot of things here. He also fought in the Battle of San Pasqual. And he was a judge of the plains and a judge at large. He was an orchardist and a vineyardist as well. So the family settled here in the Buena Vistita.
Shelley Hayes Caron's family on the Hayes side was instrumental in the development of the nearby city of Oceanside.
In 1875, Sylvester's daughter, Felipa Emarancia Marron, married John Chauncey Hayes. And John Chauncey Hayes was a pioneer of Oceanside. He's one of the founders of Oceanside. He was a surveyor, he was a justice of the peace, he was a constable, he was a mail contractor, a very avid businessman. He invested, he heard about the railroad coming, and he bought 1,240 acres along the railroad line from Oceanside to Carlsbad. And he basically promoted the development of the city. And he was also involved in the water rights. He claimed the water in the San Luis Rey River for the city use, and many other enterprises. He was sort of a Renaissance man. He was the 3rd owner of Palma Ranch at the age of 20. And he was a newspaper correspondent for the San Diego Union Tribune from 1870 to 1890. And he owned the first newspaper in Oceanside called the South Oceanside Diamond. So he was very active locally. He and Felipa lived here on the rancho. They lived in a location below this adobe called the Melted Adobe now. It was another house. And they had 14 children, and 7 of their children were born in the adobe. And my grandfather, Fred Hayes, was the 5th child of Felipa and John Chauncey. And he was raised here on the rancho. Also, he was a business with his father and his brother, John Chauncey Jr., and his older sister, Emily. and they were in the real estate business and other enterprises that the Hayes family was in Oceanside. In 1947, he undertook the enterprise of restoring this adobe house, and he spent $110,000. In that day, that was a very large amount of money. He had to pay for the telephone service to be brought out. He had to pay for all the poles for the electricity from Oceanside all the way out here. We use water, well water. We have a well that's 150 feet deep, and right outside the door here is the last remnant of the original 78 highway, the 2-lane that went from Oceanside all the way to Escondido. He had fond memories and he loved this house, so he restored it. His memories of his parents and his grandfather, visiting his grandfather. So it meant something to him, and he wanted to preserve it. The Rancho, from its original 13,311 acres, and through just many different changes, in the 50s, my grandparents had about 350 acres, but other Marrons owned property as well here in the valley. It was part of the Rancho. 160 plus acres were owned by Abe and Jenny Marron, which is the neighboring to the east of here. They had a farm and they had a quarry. That's where the Salto Falls is. Quarry operation came into being in probably after 55, 56. A gentleman by the name of Tom Struder leased the land from the Marrons to quarry the rock there. They kept up that relationship until 1973, when Tom bought the quarry from the Marrons at that time. They no longer could manage their holdings, and they couldn't afford to pay for reclamation. When the mining ceases, the law requires that you reclaim your land, and they didn't have the money to do that. So it was financially a benefit for them to sell at that time. So that was 1973. My grandparents died in 1955 and 56. My father and his brother Roby, my father Barry M. Hayes, inherited the Rancho and all the other holdings of the Hayes family at that time. And after the distribution of the estate, my father acquired the ranch and the acreage that went with it. My father was born in Oceanside. He was the eldest of 2 sons of Fred Hayes and Jemmy B. Hayes. My grandmother's mother and sisters lived in Long Beach, so my father and his brother traveled to both cities and went to school in both cities because they were, taking care of family, and that's what they did back in those days. So that my mother and father met when they were 9 years old in Long Beach, and they went to high school together there, but my father graduated from Carlsbad Oceanside High in 1933. So it's kind of interesting. He also went to military school, and he entered the armed services at the early age. He went to Hawaii, and he was in Pearl Harbor when it was bombed in 1941. I have a diary entry talking about what happened, and he was enlisted, and then he went to flight school and became a pilot, and he became an officer. He was a lieutenant when he got out of the service. It was in the Army Air Corps. My father was very young when he passed away. He had a coronary and died at the age of 53. So I had just been married just a few months, and I came to live here. I had to assume the responsibilities of my father's estate. So there were 40 acres at that time, and my father had a large amount of debts. So I didn't know anything about land or taxes or anything. This was all very new to me, but Through the course of the next 8 years, I was able to borrow money and pay off the taxes and pay off the debts. And I had to find a buyer so that I could pay off the bulk of the remaining debt. So in 1978, I sold a portion of my 40 acres to Mr. Joseph Sherman, and was able to keep my adobe and my home. I lived here as a baby. I was about 10 months old. My parents lived in Oceanside, and then when everything was finished here, we all moved in, 2 brothers and their wives. Then I came along, and I was about 10 months when I came here to live. Then my parents divorced a few years later, and so Mother and I went back to Long Beach, and my dad stayed here. Then I went to school in Long Beach, and high school and college. I went to the same junior college that my father did. When he was there, he was an honors student and student body president. And I went to the same high school and the same college as my dad. Then he went on to the military, and he pursued college education courses also, but he never graduated from college. But he went into business as a real estate consultant, and he had many businesses. He had a place in Oceanside called Dunker's Donuts at one time. He had lots of little enterprises that he and Mother owned. They were divorced, and then shortly after that, my grandmother died. I have 2 children of my own, a son and a daughter. They're 42 and 35 right now, and between them we have 5 grandchildren. We have 4 girls and 1 boy, and they've all actually lived here at one time in their life. So the seeds have been planted for the harvest. My uncle, when I got some of his business papers, my Uncle Roby, he had some files, and on the genealogy files he had written Shelley, and I became the keeper. So he must have known something about me. You know, I spent time with him when I vacationed in Carlsbad. On the years that I wasn't here, I came to visit, and so I was very interested in his library and in his books and pictures. I've always been interested in pictures. I can remember sitting with my grandmother looking at pictures, asking her who they were, and then writing on the back who the people were. And so I've now discovered pictures that I actually wrote on when I was little at 8. So it's been an interest to me. My children are very interested in their heritage, and we hope to continue this. In 1998, for public awareness, I started having the public come to the Adobe to get acquainted and to realize that there was something special here. In 2000, we became eligible for the National Register, and I started doing elementary student tours, and the local schools would come, and sometimes I'd have classes of 40 to 80 children, and they were very fascinated learning about their local history and this huge tapestry on how early California connects to this adobe. So they love the stories, and it's just been something that I've been doing for almost 15 years now. And I want to continue to do that. I want children to be able to come here and see the setting of the adobe and see what a California adobe looked like. It still has some majesty with the view and the association with the Native Americans. I think that we can evolve here to something very, very special. I'm looking to have another organic farm, and that will be something that can be given to children as well, to know where their food comes from, and it's a tradition as to where the food was grown for the Rancho. So it all ties in. Maybe we can tie in with Cal State San Marcos and and Maricosta College, and with their horticulture department and their Native American studies. And the Luiseños are getting a park here in the valley. They're getting a cultural center. So with the two features of the Adobe and the cultural center and the ecological preserve here, I think we have a lot to offer to the community for the future and for future generations. That's the goal. I can speak about the San Luis Rey mission. The San Luis Rey Band was not given mission land. They don't have ownership of anything. However, you know, they've been here for 1,500 years, and there were other Native people here from prehistoric times, thousands of years here, and their culture is still here in the ground and in the shell middens that surround the adobe. Their kitchens are still here, their metates and manos. As Spain came in and the missions came in, they were trained. They were made masons and given jobs to do. They built the missions for the Padres, and they became ranch hands. They were the first vaqueros. So they've always been here. They've just had to meld into the circumstances that they found themselves. A lot of people went to the reservations, but a lot of people stayed, you know, in the community, and they're still here today. Descendants of Honorato and Refugio Garcia are still here. As a matter of fact, their great-great-nephew is the tribal chair, Mel Vernon.
Before there were adobes and ranchos to talk about, there were Native Americans in the area. Mel Vernon, captain of the Luiseño Band of Mission Indians, relates a bit of their story as he stands beside the local waterfall sacred to his people.
Miyu. My name is Mel Vernon. I'm the captain of the San Luis Rey Band of Mission Indians. Before there's ranchos, missions, and what we see here today, this landscape that we're standing on had 6,000 years of our people living here, a sustainable life, a way of living with nature and with community. I know it's hard to grasp that 6,000 years as such a long time in many ways, but in other ways it's very short. Life was going on here for thousands and thousands of years. It's one of the places that we're at now, Salto Falls, is the water, where there was places that had water and that had habitations of wildlife and food of the time. And of course, we're not too far from the ocean. We can see an abundance of a certain time period where people were living probably in a lot easier way than in other places on the land. Once this was grazing lands for the Mission San Luis Rey. You can see that a lot of it kind of looks the same when you get into this area of the canyons that have been left open for the animal habitat. Of course, that's going to change with all the homes that are coming up here. And with those homes, there are going to be a lot more people, so the very place that we're standing on will not be accessible. But back in the day, you can only imagine, except in the backcountry, you can kind of see what our country looked like. Along with this stream. The stream is very important because that's the water that made this place green. Also, they have some springs up here. a lake, a bubbling natural spring. When we do preservation of sites and spaces, open spaces, we look to work with not only the community, the developer, the city councils, the planning commissions. You have to work with it, and sometimes there's a lot of challenge to be faced, and sometimes there's a compromise that doesn't really work, but sometimes we do have a win. When development happens, they do EIRs, and they contact sometimes the Native Americans, and sometimes people choose to participate and sometimes they don't. But we chose to participate because this waterfall, this feature, this natural water fountain, this source of beauty was going to be destroyed. When you look at some of the village sites that we have around here and in Camp Pendleton, what you see is mortars that are used to grind acorns or different types of seeds. You find different plants that were for medicine or different plants that were food. You find wildlife that was, in some of those places, are still there. But it is the water that makes it all happen. So people didn't live far from water. Here at El Salto, when people were bathing here and maybe playing in the water at certain times, the laughter that is still here. And so it's very good to preserve these places that have such significance and have survived the test of time and the challenges that have come along. And I think it's an inquisitive education to find out what's really going on here.
This program was made possible by a generous grant from the Parker Foundation. Gerald and Inez Parker.